the full spoiler for Brothers War is out. Let's talk about it. I have made a PowerPoint with every single card from the new set that I think has any degree of implication in Modern, and I am very excited to dig into everything. For the most part, my general impression of the set is that there are a lot of cards that are very interesting, flexible, have high deck building restrictions and high payoffs, lots of high synergy cards that buff archetypes and interesting sideboard options. But for the most part, it's really not going to be a set that has a big impact on the Modern format. This is not an Oath of the Gatewatch. It's just like a small supplemental set to the format that I think will be a positive addition. We have a lot to talk about, so I kind of just want to jump into it. I don't really like YouTube intros very much, to be honest. These are the 4 cards I am the most interested in. These are the 4 cards that I think are not necessarily the most powerful, but these are the 4 cards that I think have the most like deck building implications, in the sense that you can really build a deck around these 4 cards, or they can be key players in decks that you build around and like be interesting, powerful threats that can be a big part of your game plan. When a lot of the other cards we're going to talk about later are more minor role players, I guess is a good way to phrase it. The first thing to talk about is Titania, Gaia Incarnate, and then just all the Titanias and the Argoth. These 2 cards, Voice of Gaia, Argoth, they meld together to become Titania, Gaia Incarnate. If you have both of them in play and 4 lands in your graveyard, and they flip into this giant Vigilance, Reach, Trample, Haste, Power, Toughness equal to the number of lands you control. You can have a lot of lands because you get to Splendid Reclamation, bring all the lands back from your graveyard to play tapped, and you have something to do with that mana by spending 4 mana, putting 4 counters on a land, and being able to attack with it immediately, or usually the turn after that you flip Titania. This effect is very, very powerful for 3 mana. So like if you just think about what kind of resources you can get for 3 mana in Modern, if you just cast Titania, the next turn it flips, this is more powerful than I think any other 3 mana effect in the whole format, maybe, or Magic in general. Maybe not like cascading into Living End, but like just like you get a lot for 3 mana with Titania. It is true that this strategy of untapping with a 3 mana creature in Modern is very, very fragile, and it also is true that Titania requires a good amount of setup where you need to get those lands in the graveyard. You need to have Argoth in play, although it is cool that Argoth gives you some utility, being able to mill yourself to try to set up Titania and you get a bear. I think that's pretty cool. That being said, there are a lot of tools in Modern that you can use to set up Titania. You can use Elvish Reclaimer, Knight of the Reliquary, to put Argoth into play. You can use Collected Company to try to put a Titania in play in a turn, untap and trigger it. You can use Unearth to put Titania into play for 1 mana. You can use Ephemerate to protect Titania. You can use Witch's Cottage to just like redraw Titania if it dies, and then that kind of works with the self-mill aspects too. There are a lot of tools to protect it, and while, yes, again, it's not that good of a plan to try to build your entire deck around a creature, a 3-4 mana creature resolving, there are some strategies in Modern that do that. Decks that play Dryad of the Elysian Grove, decks that play Yawgmoth, decks that play the recent combo deck. I'm going to remember. I'll come back to it. The recent combo deck with Lotus Bloom. You can do it in Modern, and I'm very interested to try. I think this card is super, super powerful, but it's kind of in a weird spot in Modern, because Modern is definitely a format that has the tools to enable Titania. It is also a format that is really going to be very good at killing Titania. So I'm excited to see how this card ends up playing. Another card that I'm very, very excited for, probably the card I'm most excited for, is either this or Titania, but Phyrexian Dragon Engine. 3 mana, 2/2 double strike, enters the battlefield, but only if it enters from your graveyard. You can discard your hand, and if you do, draw 3 cards. I do love that is a May ability, by the way. You're not actually forced to do so if you just want to unearth it for damage and keep the cards in your hand. And I think this card pairs especially well with 2 cards, Goblin Engineer and Unearth. I've been saying this. I've been building a lot of decks around Goblin Engineer lately, and I think for the most part, if you are going to play Goblin Engineer in Modern, it is very important that whatever you're putting in the graveyard, or at least you have something that you can put into the graveyard that is going to give you value even if your engineer dies. And so a good example of that is Sword of the Meek, and I think Phyrexian Dragon Engine is another great example where if you cast Engineer on 2, you put your engine in the graveyard, and your opponent, like, they have to kill that engineer on the spot, or this engine is threatening to be such a crazy powerful source of card advantage. And then if they don't kill it, you still on turn 5 or whenever you have 5 mana are going to be able to unearth it and draw 3 cards and just be very ahead on cards in the more interactive matchups, and then in the less interactive matchups, in theory, your engineers will also be very good. Kind of a similar thing with Unearth, being able to unearth the engine for value is very powerful, and I think that this card is good without the meld synergies that you have with Mishra. Mishra is not a playable card in Modern, or at least not one that you want to have to play. It's like a 3-4 mana, 3/5 Hellrider type effect without haste, and if you attack with it and Dragon Engine, it melds into this 9/9, and you get to choose 2 of 6 modes, and you win the game. You win the game if you meld. It's really, really hard to meld. I do think that if you end up somehow playing lots of copies of Dragon Engine in your deck, like 3 or 4, you could maybe play a Mishra, and maybe like somehow you have like Lightning Greaves in your deck too. But my main point is, this would have to be somewhere you end up. Like, you're playing Lightning Greaves to go with Engineer and Dragon Engine, and you're this artifact deck, and you have 4 Dragon Engines in your deck. Maybe you can play Mishra. But this is really going to be, like, you would play like 1 exactly. Probably never more than 1. But it is some upside on the card and worth talking about for sure. Another card that has a lot of chatter, a lot of buzz, is Arcane Proxy. It technically costs 7, which will give you some insulation against Tasha's hideous laughter, I guess. But for the most part, this is going to be, you're going to cast it for the prototype cost, which is a 3 mana 2/1 into the battlefield. You get to cast an instant or sorcery from your graveyard with lesser mana value than Arcane Proxy's power. And so I think that this card can fit into a few existing shells and potentially has implications beyond those existing shells. I think the first copy of Arcane Proxy is very good at Rhinos. You basically never want to draw 2, but with so many redundant ways to cascade into Footfalls, it's going to be very common that this is going to be like as good as like a 9th Cascade spell that is going to be a good follow-up to your first one and give you like a little bit of an extra density of threats, and you never have to draw 2, so you only play 1. I also think the card has interesting implications in the Reanimator archetype, where it flashes back Persist, Unmarked Grave, Tainted Indulgence, and I have played a version of Reanimator that uses Witch's Cottage to buy back your Griefs and your Solitudes and your Muldrifters, and potentially set up for Aether Mage's Touch to like put an Archon on top of your library, Aether Mage's Touch to put the Archon into play. And I do think that like using Witch's Cottage to get back Arcane Proxy to like cast a Persist is something that I'm somewhat interested in trying to do. Again, kind of like a Fringe thing, but you know, this deck has implications in any deck that has powerful 2 mana sorceries, and Reanimator is one of the ones with very powerful 2 mana sorceries. It's also hard, I think, for me at least, to talk about this card and not talk about Expressive Iteration, which is probably the best 2 mana sorcery in the format. I'm not saying that this card just like goes in Murktide, but I think that you could see like maybe more of a spell-based value pile that is going to be interested in playing Expressive Iteration. This card is also 2 types for Traverse the Uvenwald, so you could play this in like a 4-color Traverse deck potentially. It has a lot of implications. Flashes back See the Truth to draw 3 cards. Just a lot of interesting build around with Arcane Proxy. I'm very excited to play with the card. Another card that I'm very excited about. This is something that really like brings the young Magic player out in me, as someone who used to just love young Pyromancer, is Third Path. I don't know how to say the Iconoclast. This is like a young Pyromancer, except it triggers on any non-creature spell, not just instants or sorceries, and it makes an artifact instead of making an elemental. And I think that making an artifact is definitely very relevant. Won't be relevant for every deck, but I could definitely see playing this card in a deck like Jeskai Breach, and you're going to be able to trigger this card off of your Mishra's Baubles and Grinding Stations and Underworld Breaches, and then all of a sudden you have these tokens in play, which make your Urza Saga token just gigantic. And I think that there's a lot of interesting implications there. It is also just true, like there's just so many cards that Mishra's Bauble really, really does power up, and you can see a deck that's playing like 4 Dragon Rage's Channeler, 4 Ledger Shredder, 4 of this card, and all these cards work really well with Mishra's Bauble. You could play this in a Murktide style shell, although it's definitely true that deck has already has a lot of like competition for the threats in that deck, if that makes sense. But definitely a card I like a lot. Definitely a card that I will be playing in a lot of shells and excited to see how it actually plays after some testing. So all that being said, I do want to move on and talk about some other cards that I like. These 5 cards are all cards that I think are very interesting, have some fun deck building restrictions, will be very fun to deck build with. They will all be Fringe archetype role players, most likely, if anything. But they are all also cards that I really want to cast and put onto the stack and do some playtesting with before I form much more of an opinion on them, because they're all pretty interesting. The first one is Combat Thresher. Combat Thresher is another prototype card. You almost always going to cast this for the prototype cost as a 3-mana 1/1 double strike, enters the battlefield, draw a card. And this is not that crazy of an effect, but you are going to want to look at this card and going to look to play it in aggressive decks that are putting pressure on their opponent with creatures that are also playing ephemerate or other ways to blink creatures. And so if you can blink this card, you turn it into a 3/3 double strike, which is huge pressure, and you get to draw an additional card as well, which is a pretty powerful thing to be doing. It is, not a super broken combo, but it is powerful enough that I am interested in looking at it. It is also an artifact, so if you're playing Urza Saga, you're going to be growing those constructs bigger. You can have some other artifact synergies, and it is also worth noting that there is a 1-mana artifact, not from this set, from a previous set. I can never remember the name of the card, but it does flicker a creature. It's a 1-drop. You pay 2, sack it, flicker a creature, and that would be interesting synergy to play if you're playing like an artifact-based flicker deck with Urza Saga. You could play that card. You could play Thought Monitor. There might be something. There might be something there. Next card on the list is Recommission, a card that is probably like the least likely of any of these on the list to actually like make a deck, but it is interesting. I've been playing some mono white combo deck, aggressive decks, mid-range decks lately, both like artifact-based mid-range decks and Heliod combo. And I could see this deck card going in either of these shells, more likely Heliod combo, but this can return an artifact or creature from your yard with mana value 3 or less, and it enters with a counter additionally. And so this card, recurring your Heliods, Walking Ballista, Ranger Captain of Eos, Ingenious Smith, Stoneforge Mystic, all seems okay. It's maybe not a card that you would want to be main decking very much, although like you can sack Ranger Captain, recur Ranger Captain, get something else. It's maybe good in particular metagames. It's a card to look at. It's a card that gets better as other things get printed. It's a card that, you could play this with Goblin Engineer and Dragon Engine. You could be like a red-white Goblin Engineer Dragon Engine deck, and you're playing Recommission as well. It's an interesting card for deck building, not likely to make much of an effect, but one that I think you should have on your radar. Next card, the Evangel of Synthesis. The more I look at this card, the more I like it. The more it's starting to like really make me feel things and think things. This is a 2-mana 2/3. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and then discard a card, and as long as you've drawn 2 or more cards this turn, it gets +1/+0 and has menace. So if you're playing a deck with like Ledger Shredder, Mishra's Bauble, I guess Bauble you have to crack on there in step, but if you're playing a deck that could draw a card every single turn, this is going to be a 2-mana 3/3 menace in Dimir that is going to loot for you and presumably set up graveyard synergies. Maybe you go smaller and you're playing like Unearth, but maybe you're playing this card in like an Esper Ephemerate Reanimator deck, and this is going to be like cheap, meaningful pressure against an opponent who's like trying to reactively protect your graveyard combo. I think this card has a lot of potential, and because like I love cards like this that are just like, this is a cheap creature that goes well with graveyard strategies. It is a very powerful threat. It has relevant creature types, being a Phyrexian Human Cleric. Go nuts. And this is definitely a card that's on my radar. I don't know that there's any deck I'd put it in right now, but the more I think about the card, the more I get excited about it. The next card is one that has had a lot of conversation about it. This is a reprint, Diabolic Intent, a reprint into Modern for the first time. It is like a Demonic Tutor in the sense that it is a 2-mana sorcery that lets you search for any creature, but as additional cost, you do have to sacrifice a creature. So this has a super duper high deck building restriction of playing lots of cheap creatures that you want to sacrifice, which is not that many decks in Modern. There's Yawgmoth, there is some Goblin Bombardment Shells, and That's kind of it. And so you could maybe see this in like a new combo deck of sort. You could maybe see this as like a 1 or 2 of in Yawgmoth. You could see this as like a 1 or 2 of in a Goblin Bombardment deck, maybe even more than that if you can figure out some interesting combos. But it is a very interesting tool for strategies like this. It's a card that like you maybe would have seen in like the Birthing Pod deck back 8 years ago, but Modern is just so different from then. It's kind of hard to evaluate in that lens. It is actually somewhat interesting with another card later on this list we'll talk about, but it's an interesting card. It's one you're going to be considering in these kind of decks. It's one that maybe opens up some combo possibilities as time goes on, and it's one that you do have to have on your radar when you're deck building sacrifice decks. Another card that is super interesting, a card I like, and a card that I need to start playing with is the fixed Skull Clamp, Transmogrant's Crown. I'm sure I didn't pronounce that correctly, but this is a 2-mana equipment giving +2/+0 instead of +1/+1/-1, and whenever a equipped creature dies, you draw 1 card instead of 2, and you equip for 2 instead of black. And I like this is the kind of card that I would like love to be good, and you could play it in like a black-white Stoneforge Mystic deck with Bloodghast and Lingering Souls and Goblin Bombardment. And like the reality is this is almost definitely too slow and too grindy and too dopey, but I would love for it to be good. And it is also like definitely true if there's ever a printed way to like sack a creature and make black mana, this card could be like potentially very powerful and very interesting. Could have combo potential down the line, could have combo potential now, and I just am not familiar with every single card that's legal, but it's a card that I like, and it's a card. This is probably one that I will be deck building with later, more than immediately. But it's one that I really hope makes a deck someday. But moving on from cards that have a lot of brew potential, I want to move on to cards that are going to be big buffs to other cards. Specifically, Goblin Engineer is a card that I think gains a ton from the set. We already talked about its synergy with Phyrexian Dragon Engine, but there's also 2 more Unearth red cards that I think work pretty well with it. Mishra's Research Desk, which is notably also an Urza Saga 2 to target. This is a card that you can play. It's 1 mana to sacrifice it, exile the top 2 cards, play 1 of them until end of turn, so kind of like a Unlucky Witness effect that you can also unearth. So this is a card that provides card advantage, and it is it's a pretty good one to recur with Goblin Engineer as well. You could like Experimental Synthesizer, Sack Synthesizer, get back Research Desk, just generate a lot of card advantage. It's not going to be super duper powerful, but it's going to be like a nice 1 of 2 to target if you're playing Engineer and or Urza Saga. And then if you are more focused in on graveyard synergies with, and there's a deck that we're about to talk about that might be doing that, but Scrapwork Mutt is a good way to is another Goblin Engineer 2 to target that can loot something from your hand into the graveyard. So let's say you're playing hypothetically a Trash for Treasure deck, and you have your Portal to Phyrexia in your hand, and you really want to get it into the graveyard, and because instead of just like tutoring it into the graveyard with Goblin Engineer like you usually would, you can get a Scrapwork Mutt and then unearth it, then put the Portal of Phyrexia into your graveyard, and then ideally use a Trash for Treasure to get it back. And so and then I guess maybe we should talk about Portal first, but Portal to Phyrexia is a 9-mana artifact, and I'd found some reasonable success with this like mono red Artifact Matters Trash for Treasure Goblin Engineer Urza Saga deck. And Portal to Phyrexia is like a really big upgrade to this deck, where I think it immediately becomes the best thing to reanimate with a Trash for Treasure, which is a 3-mana sacrifice an artifact, return an artifact from your graveyard to play. And so what Portal to Phyrexia does is it makes your opponent sacrifice 3 creatures when it enters the battlefield, and then on your upkeep, you can put a creature card from the battlefield, from a graveyard to the battlefield under your control, and it becomes a Phyrexian. And what's pretty cool about this card with Goblin Engineer is that if your Goblin Engineer dies, which it does, people just kill that card on site all the time, you can use Portal of Phyrexia to get back Goblin Engineer, and then you can put like a Sundering Titan in your graveyard to return with your Portal the following turn. So there's like synergy with like the Engineer beyond just like putting the Portal into the graveyard for your Trash for Treasure. I think this is this is kind of just like 4 cards from the Trash for Treasure deck, but I do think that at least Research Desk, Scrapwork Mutt, definitely big upgrades to Goblin Engineer as a card, and I'm really excited to be brewing with this card more in the future because I really, really do like it. Karn the Great Creator, of course, is a card that's going to get a ton of love from an artifact set, and obviously you could play Dragon Engine, Combat Thresher, any of these other artifacts. But I think the biggest one for Karn the Great Creator is definitely Brainstone. Brainstone is a 2-mana artifact that you can exile it, and you get to necromancer your opponent. Search their hand, graveyard, library for any card name, including basic lands, although you'll basically never do basic lands, and exile them permanently. And this is going to give every Karn the Great Creator deck a ton of extra equity against decks like Creativity, Primeval Titan, Living End, Rhinos. It is also true that decks that can't play Necromancia now have access to a colorless Necromancia effect. And I think that there's not going to be very many decks that want this, but I do think like 4-color Omnath, Blue-White Control, these are decks that could consider playing this, and it's going to be like pretty good on the play and not as good as on the draw, but I could see it definitely being better. And like at the very least, right now in Modern, there are a ton of decks that are just built around one card. Creativity, Titan, Living End, Yawgmoth. There's so many decks that just like really are like weak to the Necromancia effect, and so this card is definitely coming at a really good time. Additionally, I think that there are 2 like kind of smaller Karn the Great Creator buffs, so I've kind of made these cards smaller on the slide. But Blade Coil Serpent is a card I really like. I don't think it's going to be... I think it is only ever going to see any play as a Karn the Great Creator tutor target, and one that obviously can generate a decent amount of colored mana. I see this card specifically going in a pet deck of mine, the Urborg Cabal Coffers deck, but it is true that the deck also plays Cascading Cataracts to go with Golos, and you can use the other colors to get different modes. And the card is very powerful, just the ability to draw cards, make your opponent discard cards, give it haste. It's very flexible, very powerful, and I could see the more color intensive, so basically not Tron, Karn the Great Creator decks being interested in playing this as a tutor target. There's also Cityscape Leveler, which I think maybe doesn't end up making the cuts, but it kind of is probably going to be metagame dependent, and you probably only want to play this in Eldrazi Tron or Mono Green Tron. But it is an 8/8 trample. Whenever you cast it or attacks, you get to destroy 1 non-land permanent, and they make a Power Stone. But I think that Power Stones in Modern Constructed are usually not going to be that relevant for your opponent to have access to, and it is also definitely true that if you're tutoring it, then you're probably not going to, need this against a deck like Affinity that's going to use the Power Stone token very well. It also has Unearth, which is something. You could maybe also play this card in like the Trash for Treasure deck too, but you don't get the trigger on Cast for Treasure. That's kind of the big problem. Additionally, Urza Saga is also a card that is getting some extra tools. Most specifically, Haywire Might. I think that this is the big one. This is a 1-mana 1/1 insect, so if you mill it with Grist, you get an extra token. And whenever it dies, and it's usually gonna die because you sacrifice it, you gain 2 life, which is really nice. And then you get to exile target non-creature artifact or non-creature enchantment. And so like tutorable artifact enchantment hate off of Urza Saga is great. And I think that every single green deck that plays Urza Saga, Red Green Breach, Amulet Titan, just to name the Hardened Scales, name like the first 3 that come to my mind. John Saga, there's no one. A lot of decks are going to play this as a 1-of. I think there are some metagames your main deck that you'll usually sideboard it. Additionally, Urza Saga can now get you some card advantage with either Combat Courier in blue decks or Mishra's Research deck, which you already talked about in red decks. Going to be very small. Not every Saga deck is going to necessarily be interested in this. I do think that Combat Courier is one I'd be pretty down to play in like mono blue affinity or like a blue affinity decks in general, but at least just as a 1-of tutor target. Very small buffs, but cards to know about. Additionally, usually there's more cards on this list from sets, but I do think that these are 3 really good sideboard cards for Modern from the new set. Sideboard cards are obviously very important, even if they're not the most exciting. But here we have Lorien of the Third Path, which maybe will look somewhat innocuous or not that exciting, whatever. But it is really important to note that this is the first mono white Reclamation Sage. This effect, this 3-mana creature that enters the battlefield, destroys an artifact or enchantment, has only existed on green cards or green-white cards in the past. There are 2-mana cards in white that kill enchantments. This is the first one that is 3 mana or less, and destroys artifacts or enchantments. And it's also better than just that. It has vigilance, which is something. And then it also, you can make you and a target opponent draw a card, which neither of these are very relevant. You're going to play this if you're a white deck that wants a Reclamation Sage. It is a human too, so like it's a human Reclamation Sage, which is pretty relevant. I think the knight, the green-white knight that is a disenchant or +2 counters or gain 4 life is not a human. I think it's an elf. So that is also relevant, and I think will just be a sideboard card for decks like humans, mono-white decks. Additionally, there is Brotherhood's End, so pretty standard, pretty boring. 3 damage to each creature, each planeswalker, destroy all artifacts with mana value 3 or less. You're going to sideboard this against decks like Hammer Time, Affinity, when they're popular. There's also a card, Calamity's Wake. People are really hyped for this. I think it's 2 mana. My webcam, I'll pause the video after this and move it, but it's 2 mana. Exile all graveyards. Players can't cast non-creature spells till this turn. Exile Calamity's Wake. So this is like a combination spell-based combo graveyard hate. It is fine. You'll want to play it in some meta games. You'll definitely want to consider it when you're building your sideboards. But right now in the current modern meta, I have a hard time wanting to play this over Hallowed Moonlight. You would want to play this if like Living in Dredge, Rhinos are like really popular and there's like not a lot of creativity. And I have a hard time seeing that being the environment anytime soon, but it is a card to know about, and it is a card you will play sometimes in some metagames. Okay, moving on. Hardened Scales gets a couple possible options. Teething Wormlet, 1 mana, 1/1. Death Touch as long as you control 3 or more artifacts. And whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. And if it's the first time it's resolved this turn, it gets a counter. So it's kind of like an Ingenious Smith that is 1 less mana, but you don't get the card, which is huge. But it also lets you stay potentially mono green, which is pretty impactful as well. I think right now I probably would not choose to include Teething Wormlet in Hardened Scales, but I do think that more experienced pilots of the deck may be more interested in the card than I realize, and there could be some metagames where 1 mana, 1/1 Death Touch is better than others. Another card that I do think is interesting if you're playing green-white Scales, and one that I think you're actually more likely to play, is Yotia Dissident. This is a 2 mana, 1/1. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield, get a counter on target creature you control. And this card I think you would probably play it as like a 1 or 2 of, but you can have some crazy turns where you like sack your Hangerback Walker to Arcbound Ravager. You get a counter trigger for each token that enters the battlefield. It's better with the 1-drop. Whenever a counter enters something, you make a servo, then you trigger this again. It's really not a card that you can probably like afford to draw 2 of ever, so a 1 or 2 of in Scales, but like a very good like to draw the first copy is this kind of card usually. And then I want to move on to the section of cards I'm calling radar cards. This is a term I've used in the past and one I kind of want to use going forward for these videos, but these are cards that are on my radar. These are not cards I think I'm going to do like any deck building with, or any deck building with anytime soon, but they're on my radar and they're in my brain, and potentially they will be better after play testing or like looking at them closer. Potentially new cards will get printed for them, and I want to put them on your radar, but don't really expect me to register them anytime soon. One of them is Hajar, Loyal Bodyguard, a card I think is actually really good in Pioneer. There are lots of like nice, powerful, legendary tribal payoffs like Joda, Bard Class. This card seems phenomenal. Mox Amber card seems phenomenal in a deck like that. I don't, at the time of making this comment, think a deck like that can exist in Modern or thrive in Modern, but I think after some deck building, it could be something we do. Also, No One Left Behind. This is one of my favorite cards in the set, just like design-wise, but this is a 2 mana Unearth, and then for 3 extra mana, it can reanimate any creature. And right now, I don't really feel like this card fits in any deck, but I could see this card being like potentially okay in Scam, where like for 2 mana, you get back like Ragavan, Voidwalker, Season Pyromancer, and then for 5 mana, you can get back a Fury or Grief in the late game, and like you can play it as a 1-of, and it's like somewhat flexible, and maybe it like enables you to play Fulminator Mage in the sideboard or something like that. But again, very fringe, probably not going to register it, probably worse than Unearth in most decks, but something to be on your radar. Another card is a card that maybe would have been playable in Modern before Dominaria United, but Lay Down Arms. You exile a creature with mana value less than or equal to the number of planes you control. Its controller gains 3 life. Really not that bad of a removal spell. Any deck that's playing all planes or almost all planes is going to want to look at this. But the problem is white just has the best removal in the format. You have Solitude, Leyline Binding, Prismatic Ending, and Lay Down Arms is worse than all of those cards, and it's really just not hard to make any of those cards work in a deck. So there's maybe a strategy that will emerge that will want this card more than those other premium removal spells, or want this as like a one of. It's also a big problem this card doesn't deal with like Murktide Regent, Primeval Titan, Archon of Cruelty, but it is one to have on your radar. Additionally, Lorien's Escape. There are some decks that like Boros, Lubomancer, Hammer Time makes a bit more common, that are interested in protection spells. But for the most part, this is a really, really good protection spell. But for the most part, it's going to be worse than Blacksmith skill decks. So you're gonna want this in decks that want protection spells, that don't want to play that. It's a little bit worse than Blacksmith skill because you don't have artifact creatures, which is not the very many strategies, but if you ever find yourself building a deck with that requirement, you can play Lorien's Escape as in some numbers. Additionally, Bitter Reunion is a really weird card. It's like an enchantment Tormenting Voice. Enters the battlefield, you may discard a card if you do draw 2, and you can sack it to give creatures haste. And this card, I think if Reanimator ever gets better, like if there's ever like, if you can ever play like more Persist, or like there's something as good as Persist, this card seems kind of crazy. If you go like turn 2 Reunion, discard Archon, turn 3 Persist Archon, then give it haste. I think that could be potentially really powerful. Right now, I don't think that you can really make this work, but it is also worth noting this gives all of your creatures haste. There could be some interesting shells for it. Additionally, the Archaeologist here is a 2-mana 0/3. Enters battlefield, mill 3. You can put a non-creature, non-land card into your hand, and then mill the rest. And so this is kind of like a Satyr Wayfinder for spells, non-creature spells. It's also an 0/3, blocks Ragavan, definitely like not the worst stat block to have in Modern. And also not a card I can like think of that goes in any shell at the moment in Modern, but I have registered Satyr Wayfinder in Modern in the past. This card is better than Satyr Wayfinder in other shells, so it's on my radar. So definitely don't want to spend too much time on these cards, but it is important to talk about them. Okay, and then this is kind of like the step below radar cards, what I like to call eyebrow cards. So the big difference between radar cards and eyebrow cards. Radar cards are usually like enablers, fringe enablers that like work to power up specific archetypes or supplement different archetypes to be a smaller role player in synergistic decks. Eyebrow cards are a bit different. They are more so the payoffs, the big exciting payoff. And I'm raising my eyebrow because I don't really feel like any of these cards work at the moment in Modern. Ashnod, Flesh Mechanist. Like, I don't think that there's a deck in Modern that's interested in a sacrifice outlet that gives you Power Stones. That's a very weird card to have. But this card does a lot, and it's 1 mana, and it's raising my eyebrow. One with the Multiverse is incredibly strong for 8 mana. Having this combination of Future Sight Omniscience is really, really strong. There's also just not a good way to cheat enchantments into play in Modern, or at least 8-mana enchantments into Modern. But it is one that, like, if there's ever just a way to put this card into play for 4 mana, you have a deck. You know what I mean? And so this is definitely one I'm going to keep my eyes on going forward. Mechanized Warfare is also really interesting to me. There's never really been an enchantment-based damage buffer for 3 mana. Usually this kind of like permanent based, your permanents deal extra damage, or like on a 4 mana creature that can die, or they're symmetrical and they're 4 mana. But this only makes your things deal 1 extra damage, but it's only 3 mana, and it's a very interesting effect. And I can't think of any deck that wants it. It has potential. My eyebrows are raised, but it's not something I'll be picking up anytime soon. Additionally, Slagstone Refinery reads like a card that has big combo potential. Whenever it or another non-token artifact is put into a graveyard, you make a Power Stone. This is not a once per turn situation. Triggers off cards like Mishra's Bauble. Triggers off like Grinding Station. There could be some like crazy combo with it, and Paradox Engine. Almost definitely not. Could be a Karn target in the combo deck. Again, my eyebrows raised. I'm very unlikely to register this card ever, or until like other cards are printed for it. So, but I do think that these kind of cards are important to remember. If you are someone that is brewing and trying new things, like you just have to have these cards in your in your data bank. But that is all the cards I thought were interesting to talk about. Thank you for watching this video. It was a bit longer than I expected. I'm Aspiring Spike. Thank you for watching. Blah, 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 blah. YouTube stuff. Goodbye.